Dr. Robertson, thank you so much for coming to VOA to do this.
My pleasure.
The People's Republic of China, PRC, has long been accused of engaging in the systematic harvesting and trafficking of forcibly acquired organs. Since 2015, Chinese authorities have claimed that the organs are sourced solely from voluntary donors. But of course, we know there are serious doubts or questions remain about the credibility of these claims, right? I know you've done a lot of research on this subject, so could you share your findings and shed light on the current situation regarding the organ procurement practices in the PRC?
Yes, well put. So the first thing is there's a lot of different things going on simultaneously, I suspect. And the reason I even say that is because it's hard to actually even know precisely what's going on because of government secrecy, falsification of official registry data sets, and then, just the opacity with which this system operates. But I'll tell you my take.
Right. Yeah.
Something definitely happened around 2014, 2015. I think this is fairly clear, and there are certainly actual voluntary donations going on in China today. That's my belief based on a whole bunch of evidence.
Right.
And however, there are many issues that don't add up or that make the official story that everything is clean now quite difficult to believe. Just to begin with, there has been no accountability or a kind of redress of anything that happened in the past, 30 years of the transplantation system. So all sorts of questions about where organs were sourced from, the role of surgeons in procuring the organs, whether the donors, so to speak, were actually alive at the time or in fact deceased, where profits went when they had a market like this. So many questions about that system and the individuals who participated in it. That is just all a black box. And so just at the beginning level, it would be strange to think that in a circumstance where there's been zero accountability and redress for what has happened, that the system would be suddenly cleaned. But that's not evidence, it's just sort of the background. We also know that the official figures associated with the reform appear to have been falsified. So myself and two colleagues, a statistician and a cardiac transplant surgeon, have a paper on that in 2019. And so we look at the official data sets that were published by the state. It's a long and detailed paper and has all kinds of statistical diagnostics, and it has a lot of appendices and so on. But the long and the short of it is the official data sets appear to have been falsified based on a simple mathematical model. And there are like 3 different kinds of data sets, and we find anomalies in all of them. And so we won't get into all the details, like it's out there. And I think that's a big question. So, okay, they're doing some voluntary organ donations, but the official numbers are falsified, so we can't know how many they're actually doing. At the same time, given that there's been no transparency and no redress, it's not clear why they would not continue whatever practices they were, carrying on in the past. So I'm sure we'll get to that in a second. But to the extent that if they were killing religious prisoners or death row prisoners, or there were even cases of beggars and others being kidnapped and just killed for their organs, and those incidents, that was allowed to happen, then it's not clear why we should believe that would change based on anything the state has done. And then finally, and kind of, it's very concerning that there's been a massive detention of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and we know that they had been blood tested systematically. So we have, from the Xinjiang police files, my colleague, Dr. Adrian Zenz, received this data set, like 500 gigabytes of internal police materials from 2 counties in Xinjiang. And they basically conducted a population census of everyone in these counties, and in many cases, so they're recording, ID number, name, date of birth, sex, etc., and much of the time they're also recording the blood type. That's concerning. And then there are survivors who talk about highly targeted and concerning medical examinations, so repeated blood tests and urine tests, ultrasounds, CT scans, and this particular configuration of tests is concerning because they're exactly the tests you would need to assess organ health and donor compatibility, and they're not obviously, they don't have some other obvious medical demand for people that they're incarcerating, in giant numbers. And so China's still doing a lot of organ transplants. They have this particular source that they say they came from now, but that source, the volunteers, but there are all sorts of questions about the actual scale of that. And then you have this mass, detention and impunity and no transparency around what happens to the people in that situation.
Right. So you mentioned about the situation in Xinjiang, but we also know that Falun Gong practitioners have long stated that they have been the main targets, right, of forced organ harvesting. So can you shed some light on that? I mean, what is your assessment of the scale and the scope of that? I mean, is it still going on today?
I don't know. So I can tell you what what I think is going on or what has happened, and kind of the way I think about China's transplantation sector very briefly. So, and this is basically just reading internal documents and medical papers, so you can access internal party memos and things in certain databases. So it appears that the situation is like this. There is a healthcare system for Chinese elite. A vice chair of that commission, the healthcare commission, is called Baojianwei, has been a transplant specialist since the 60s and 70s, and that continues till today. And we know just from a huge amount of public records that military hospitals, which serve the party, perform a lot of transplants and have very advanced transplant infrastructure. So until 2015, even according to all official statements, there were almost no voluntary donors in China. So, for example, up until 2009, there were either 120 or 130, depending on the official, but there are 3 sources where it's a leading transplant administrator saying very explicitly, we've performed 120, one other guy says 130, transplants from voluntary donors until 2009. So just think about that date. So there's been, a period from the 80s until 2009 where it's 0 actual volunteers. So it means that all of those organs, even according to official orthodoxy, were from prisoners. So the government says those were only death row prisoners. So it's simply a question of the plausibility of that claim. Like, how believable is it that that is the only source of organs? And then there are just many, many indicators that it's not the sole source of organs. So, and very briefly, we can just talk about a few. If you as part of my dissertation at the Australian National University, I downloaded over 100,000 PRC medical publications, and then found the ones that are about transplant, and then filtered them for clinical transplant activity on certain organs, and so on and so on. And so you can see that just the number of papers being published about liver transplants kidney transplants, heart transplants, they all suddenly increase very steeply in the year 2000. There is no obvious reason that should be the case in this specific, in this specific year. So that's 6 months after the mass detention of Falun Gong, when that repression started in July 99. So there's already something. Like, what happened with the transplant system that has such a temporal coincidence with this mass detention? And then there are many very specific diagnostic pieces of evidence about the targeting of that group. For example, similar to Uyghurs, there are many anecdotes of blood tests, targeted blood tests and urine tests, and ultrasounds and CT scans and so on. There's a great deal of phone calls with officials in hospitals where investigators are trying to get them to admit to getting organs, and where are they coming from, and are they coming from Falun Gong and so on. So there's all kinds of things going on in those phone calls, but they're at least quite suggestive, because you often have officials saying they can get organs on demand and making all kinds of very surprising admissions. There's many more things, just another one of them really quickly. So before 2099, there were almost, I couldn't find any in the medical literature, instances of something called emergency transplants. And so that is where an organ has been sourced, or a liver, emergency liver transplant, but it's where a liver has been sourced within 24 to 48 hours after the presentation of a patient with liver failure. So if a patient shows up at a hospital and their liver is failing, they will die unless they get a new liver, well, in this particular scenario. And so how that happens in the US or the UK is that there's a national network, and that person goes straight to the top of the medical priority list, and then if there is a tragedy like a car accident or something, then and the donor is compatible and they agree, or their family agrees to donate, or they were a registered donor, then that liver will be allocated to that person who has the liver failure. So we don't know how Chinese hospitals performed between 25% and 30% of all the recorded liver transplants that they themselves published in their annual liver transplant registries that they later deleted from the internet. They report in 2005 and 2006 that 30%, around 30%, and then around 25% of all the liver transplants that they did in the hospitals that was part of the registry were from on an emergency basis. So it's basically they must have had a pool of blood-typed donors. So people had already been tested and their blood compatibility was known. And because that's happening across the country, this would have to be in lots of different hospitals, and then they were executed on demand. There's not any other plausible story. I won't waste time talking about a potentially very unlikely scenario that doesn't really make sense. So it's these kinds of things where it's called inference to best explanation. That is, there is some outcome that is a puzzle, needs to be explained. The official explanation doesn't account for the observations, and so we have some other story or some other account for what explains it. And of course, perhaps until present, but it's much more complicated since 2015 because of the introduction of voluntary donors, the scale of which we don't know. But certainly, it seems obvious that that's the Falun Gong repression is the obvious explanation for the outcome. So I think the people who aren't sure, or they are demanding different kinds of proof, or they want a video or something, they probably haven't thought logically about the outcome that needs an explanation, and then the different pieces of evidence that plausibly explain it.
Right. So in 2022, you published a paper, right? And you state that your findings reveal a uniquely close and a long-running collaboration between the PRC's medical establishment and its public security system. So you talked about this a little bit. Just tell us a little bit more about how that system works in practice, right? I think in your paper you describe this as medicalized extrajudicial killing. So I'm wondering, since you published that paper, have you received any reaction or response from the Chinese government, whether official or informal?
No, they haven't responded to that.
Right.
I'm not sure that we described it as extrajudicial killing in that paper, but nevertheless, what we find is simply that that heart procurement operations were that the method of execution of the donor was the removal of their heart. So these could have been judicial executions carried out in a medicalized manner. So that is, the court sentences someone to death, and instead of like a firing squad, a transplant surgeon removes their heart. Like that is a possibility. It sounds absolutely crazy, but so just in terms of the bare finding, what we're doing there is like we're looking through these medical papers about heart transplants, and then we are attempting to establish, is the donor, who must be brain dead for a heart transplant, was the declaration of their brain death, were they actually diagnosed as brain dead, or could they have been diagnosed as brain dead? And then we find some specific, very diagnostic evidence related to the timing of their intubation, that is when they're put on a ventilator, and the performance of something called the apnea test to actually ascertain brain death. And we find that there was no test for brain death, and they were intubated after they were declared to be brain dead in the papers. And that's impossible because you need to be intubated before you can be declared to be brain dead. And so it's a very explicit piece of evidence in these papers that shows, according to the papers, that those donors were not dead. That is, they were alive at the time that their heart was removed. So the heart removal is actually the cause of death, or the killing method. We don't know the identity of the donors. So there could be political prisoners in there, there could be judicial executees in there. But that was that paper.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, we know these practices have been a global concern, right, for many, many years. I wonder how, maybe you can tell us a bit about how have the United States and the international transplant and medical communities responded to China's this kind of practices? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about, in your view, what more could be done to stop this kind of practice?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Generally, I don't think they've showered themselves in glory in how they have responded to this issue. How one interprets that, there are kind of different explanations for why they have responded the way they have, but generally, the global transplant and health bodies have been unconcerned with all the stuff that we've just talked about. For example, has the PRC been conducting extrajudicial killings of their own citizens and profiting from trafficking in their organs? This is something that the Transplantation Society or the World Health Organization have not dedicated any resources to understanding. On the contrary, they have been uninterested. They haven't been keen to dig into that question. So the basis of their interaction is, in their words or their understanding, to help China transition to a volunteer-based donation system. And so they say it's not their job to figure out what has happened in the past, or even if it's ongoing to some degree, but they have said that what they can do is encourage China to use voluntary donors and level some mild criticism, I would call it mild anyway, of their use of death row prisoners. So they're willing to acknowledge that, but they're not willing to go any further to talk about the kind of the unexplained question about all the organ sources and the growth of the system in the 2000s and so on. So, I mean, that's the general stance. There are some notable exceptions. The International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation has a policy of not publishing anything from surgeries performed in the PRC because of the huge questions about organ sourcing and the trust in the practices at present. So in that case, it's a professional association that is simply distancing themselves from whatever is going on in China. In terms of what alternative models for addressing something like this, the experience between PRC and the the World Psychiatric Association in the mid-noughts is very instructive, because at that time China was using psychiatric abuse, incidentally, against Falun Gong, primarily. And at that time, Human Rights Watch and a number of notable psychiatrists and people in international psychiatry put the Chinese Psychiatric Association under tremendous pressure. And it was mainly a professional association, the WPA, the World Psychiatric Association, that was bringing it to a head. They were dragged into it kicking and screaming by advocates and so on. They didn't want to actually exert this pressure on China, but they did. And then when it seemed like China would be kicked out of world psychiatry, they seem to have stopped that abuse. It seems to have had a resurgence in recent years against other dissidents, but that basically went away, at least in the repression of Falun Gong. They just stopped using psychiatric torture as a method of repression, apparently because of this tremendous international pressure. So that's like a very interesting alternative model that basically is completely the opposite of how the transplantation establishment has approached the issue. So that would be something definitely that they could consider.